Hello, global gardeners, and welcome to another wonderful Gardening Monday as we talk about what's happened in the last week, the next week, the garden seasons ahead, and all those other wonderful topics we like to share on a Monday morning for me, but afternoon and evening for some of you. So great to see all the global gardeners checking in from all over the world. We've got some good stuff going on today. I'll be talking a lot more about starting seeds and planting your garden, but a focus today will be on weather and how you can use the knowledge of gardening techniques to overcome some of those problems you might have with harsh weather, because many of us do encounter a lot of harsh weather. Great to see everybody checking in. Caribbean House, good morning to you. I also want to give a shout out to Jean Lucas. This is the first live for her, so glad you can join us today. And also a shout out to Rachel McGraw, who notified us on the Facebook group this morning that she'll be watching in her Gardener Scott shirt. So it's so great to see all of you here today, and I'm definitely looking forward to another wonderful day. Thanks ahead of time to the moderators we have. We've got Heidi and Jay and Kiri that will be following along and helping guide you as well. So throw out your questions, especially if it's a question about weather. And if I can't get to it, hopefully one of the moderators or one of the other extremely knowledgeable gardeners that are watching along today can help you out. I want to go ahead and start with a question that Mark Trimble had from Zone 3A, which means a pretty cold winter, and asking about when to start tomatoes. With a last frost date of June 8th, is wondering if he's too late or at least running behind schedule. And I would say don't worry, Mark, at all. In fact, it's too early to be starting your tomatoes in an area with a last frost in that first week of June. My official last frost here in my Colorado Zone 5B garden is May 18th. And generally, you start your tomato seeds indoors 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. So I won't be starting my tomatoes until the first week of April. And my last frost date is almost 3 weeks ahead of yours. So I would say the middle of April is probably a good target for you to think about starting your tomatoes. So you've still got a whole month before you need to worry about it at all. And so if he's already started his tomatoes, my guess is he's going to have very tall, lanky tomatoes when it comes time to actually transplant them outside. And so for all of you, that's one of those determination points when it comes to starting your seeds indoors, is how big do you want your plants when you put them outside? And so I like a relatively large, stocky tomato plant to transplant. So I tend to start my seeds closer to the 8-week point, and that's 8 weeks before I'm planning on putting them outside. And so I won't put my tomato plants, in fact, I won't put many of my warm season plants like the squashes and the peppers and the melons out until the very beginning of June. So even though I have a last frost in the middle of May, I'll use that as a target. And so I'll start my seeds within that 6 to 8 range for tomatoes, 6 to 8 weeks. So I'll start the seeds 6 weeks before my last frost date, but I'm really not planning on putting them outside until the 8-week point after I've started the seeds. And by then, with tomatoes, 2 months of growing should give nice, good, strong plants. But if you like smaller plants to put out in your garden, well, then delay when you start your seeds. And if you like bigger plants, well, then it's okay to start early. The guidelines that you'll see on seed packages are just that. It's a guideline, and you can easily modify 1 week or 2 weeks in either direction. So this gets to that experience point that we are all striving for and trying to figure out just exactly when the best point is. For me, I start my tomatoes about 2 months before I'm actually putting them outside. So don't worry, Mark, you got lots of time ahead. Okay, Kira, Corey Dorable, good to see you this morning. Glad that you're here. It's so nice to see everybody checking in. Denise is here from sunny Wisconsin. I saw that it's cold in Florida today, and Cincinnati at Shandy's Garden Zone 6B. And you'll probably be a couple weeks ahead of me, so I'm guessing you're those of you in Zone 6B are probably already thinking about starting your tomato seeds maybe a little bit a week or two from now. And as I pointed before, that's a guess. Remember that your zone really doesn't have much to do with your vegetable garden. The zones identify how cold you get in the winter. And so I can make a guess that if you're in zone 3A, that you're probably in some place like Wisconsin or Alaska where it's very cold. Whereas if you're in a zone 6, you're probably in an area like Missouri or let's say Tennessee. That's a guess just based on general cold temperatures of the winter. But don't use your zone number when determining when to start your seeds. Use your last frost date as that point that you determine. So Tito Vlogs, starting to get some warm weather in Ohio. Can't wait. I think all of us are in that mode. We've been bordering on some record high temperatures over the last couple days. So it's really, really tempting to get out and do some of that gardening work. And I know a lot of you are chomping at the bit as well. But here in Colorado, in the area I'm at, and Pueblo, Denver, Colorado Springs, we're going to have 3 days of snow coming up this weekend. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday are all set up to be snow all day long. So even though today we're getting real close to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 21 degrees Celsius, I'm going to be outside spreading some mulch, moving some things around in the garden. In just a few days, we're dropping back down into freezing temperatures with snow. And that's why I want to talk about the weather as we progress through today's live stream, because especially as new gardeners, try not to be tempted by the good weather and the fact that it looks like you can go out and garden. Instead, you really want to learn your weather in your garden, because just this weekend we went to one of the garden centers and they're starting to get ready for their plants. They're setting up all the shelves, they're laying out all the hoses, and my guess is that some of these big box garden centers are going to start selling plants in my area within the next week. And some of those plants they're going to be selling should not be put in the garden for a couple months because of the last frost date and the weather concerns that might develop. And so as you progress through the spring in particular, and this holds true for all of us, but especially for new gardeners, really start paying attention to the weather and how the weather influences not only your activities, but your garden space and how it's going to influence your plants. And if you learn more about the weather and begin to understand how you can use it to your benefit, but at least so it doesn't destroy your garden, you will have more success. Sue Pfeiffer, good morning to you. Thank you so much for that super chat. I appreciate it more than I can say. And so let's get to some of the questions you might have. I'll get back to the weather as we're proceeding. Ancient Gardening is saying there are cold season plant seeds that you can get into the ground now, and seeding in the garden beds before the snow will let the garden off to an early start. Stay with cold season plants. And so I did talk a little bit about this in my winter sowing video, where you can get seeds out early, and then as the spring warms up and the soil warms up and the snow is gone, some of those plants will start growing. But exactly, that's one of those ways that when you learn about the weather, you make a decision as to what type of plants you're going to grow. And so you can still grow the cool season plants when it's cool outside, when it's cold, even when it's snowy. You can grow kale and lettuce and Swiss chard and beets and spinach. There's a long list of plants, the cool season plants that can handle some cold. And so you can grow those when the weather is still cool. But you need to wait until after danger of frost and the soil has warmed up for those warm season plants like the tomatoes and the melons and the peppers and the squashes. And so as you observe your conditions in your area, you'll be able to better understand just exactly how the last frost date plays into your planning and your seed selection and your calendar for when you actually put those seeds out. Kim Toby, welcome on a Monday. Thank you so much for that super chat. Jennifer Segrist checking in. Good to see you here. Nguyen Chan is asking, can you germinate seeds in root cubes? Yes, you can. And I'm guessing you're asking about like the rock wool cubes, the cubes that are used for a lot of aquaponics maybe, or hydroponics. And you can root in those. I would caution against it if you're asking about a soil block where you're actually using a cube that is made with a seed starter or potting soil mix. Then you can definitely start your seeds in there and then transplant or up pot into a larger size container. One of the issues with starting seeds in a cube, if it is an inorganic material, it works fine in aquaponics, but if it's something you're going to be putting out into your garden outside, it's not any material that's going to decompose. And so when you are working in your beds and later amending your soil, you'll still have those little cubes that are virtually intact after you've pulled up the plants or thinned out or harvested. And so you can do it. I prefer to stay with organic mixes for starting my seeds and then growing my transplants. So Lilia Cardoso is asking, how would you root blackberry cuttings? And so I haven't done that yet. I've been thinking about doing that, a video on that on my raspberries. But for most cuttings, the key difference is whether it's a softwood or hardwood cutting, a green cutting, or an old wood cutting. And there are a couple different methods, and there's lots of good videos and lots of information you can find on that. The basic process usually falls into one of two methods. One is to actually soak them in water until you start to see some root development and then transplant them, or put cuttings of any type of wood that you're trying to propagate into a pot with a moist medium. You can use sand. I will actually use a well-draining potting soil, and then you just wait until it roots. The downstairs right now, and you can see it in the background of some of my recent videos, I have been propagating some yew and also some boxwood, and I just took cuttings of those different plants, and I used the pot with wet soilless mix, and they're doing great. You won't necessarily expect to get 100% of your cuttings, but you can still get a pretty good amount. I'll be doing some more videos on that. I've been filming my yew propagation over the last year and hope to have a video where I talk about how you can propagate from cuttings, hopefully within the next few months. We'll see how that comes out. Pat Patrick, good morning to you. Thank you for that contribution. It was helpful for me to learn not to use the online weather sources exclusively. They are generally 5 to 8 degrees different from my location. Excellent point. And that's one reason why I wanted to talk about your garden and your weather, because I know in my area, I actually live outside of Colorado Springs. I'm about 500 to 800 feet in elevation higher than the city. And so that means I'm going to have a 2 to 3 degree difference consistently. And so if I'm watching the local news channels, and if I'm getting my news from the Weather Service, which is actually based out of Pueblo, Colorado, which for me is about 45 minutes away, there's going to be differences from the weather in my garden to the weather that is being reported by some of the weather services. And so it's good that you've identified that, Pat, because if you can figure out that basic pattern, that if the forecast is going to be 70 degrees, 21C, and you find out with your own thermometer in your garden that it's going to be higher or lower, you can now start using that in your planning. And that's one reason why I say my last frost date is May 18th, but I don't put plants in the ground until the beginning of June, is because of that. The Weather Service might tell me what my last frost date is, but that's based on this general area, which is generally lower altitude. And so because my garden is above 7,000 feet elevation, it stays colder longer. And so I can't rely exclusively, like you, Pat, on what the Weather Service tells me. Instead, I have to make minor modifications to forecasts based on my experience in my garden. And that's one of those things I'm encouraging you to do beginning now. If you aren't doing it already, that's one of those things that you can throw in your garden journal, you can put on a spreadsheet, and just start keeping track of what the forecast is and what your actual garden conditions are. And when you start seeing the differences, it might actually be surprising. Like you might see a 5 to 8 degree difference. And so that what may also help explain for you, if you've been putting some plants in the ground early and they don't survive very well, it could be just because of something like that, where your weather conditions are different than the weather conditions in the surrounding area, but you've been using that primary National Weather Service forecast in determining how you do things. So each garden is different, each garden is unique, and you've got to figure out what it is that makes your garden different than some of the information you're getting, and then you can definitely move forward with it. Cherie is saying, hi Scott. Hi Cherie. How long do I need to soak my new pear tree before planting? If it's a bare root tree, I'll typically soak for 1 to 2 hours and then I'll plant it. The bare roots are generally shipped and they take 2 to 3 days, sometimes a week. And so the roots can start to dry out. They should be packed in sawdust or shredded newspaper to keep them moist, but that isn't always the case. I got some trees last year that had terrible packing at the roots, and there really wasn't much, and I could tell the roots were dried. So in that case, I let those soak for about 2 hours. Most of the time, an hour is good enough. If you read the directions when you get your tree, it should specifically say do not soak for more than like 4 or 5 hours, because you can actually cause a little bit of damage. The roots can expand, and you just need enough to rehydrate them before you put them in the ground. So bare root tree, just a couple hours before you plant it should be fine. If it's a potted tree, then I wouldn't worry too much about it. That soil in the pot should be staying moist until it comes time for you to plant. So there's no extra saturation you need to worry about if you're going to transplant a potted tree. But the bare roots, yeah, just a couple hours you can get away with fine. Chris, good morning to you. I'm in Northeast Tennessee, and my mom says peaches don't grow here, but Walmart is selling them. Who do I believe? Great question. And that's one reason why I started talking about the big box centers starting to get their plants out now, even though they shouldn't go in the ground for a couple months. I see that very, very often. And so there are a few things you need to do, especially in Tennessee with peaches. And so I'll share some of the experience I have. So I'm in a zone 5B garden, which means my average lowest winter temperature is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That's minus 26 Celsius. And we've already seen that a few weeks ago. And so historically, that's how cold we get. So when I go to buy plants, I'm looking for plants that on the tag of the tree or the grass or the perennial plant of whatever type it is will tell me that that plant can survive in zone 5. If it's a zone 7 or 8 plant, it won't survive my winters. And so that's the first step to take. If you're going to be looking for peach trees, is what zone in Tennessee is your mother in? And then as you look at the peach trees, determine if the peach tree matches that zone. Now, I have 2 peach trees in my yard now, and I chose varieties that were good down to a zone 5B. And generally, they don't break it into A and B. And so if it says good to zone 5, well, that actually means for me, it's 5 degrees colder that plant can handle. And so as long as you get a tree that is suitable for the winter, it should survive through the winter. So now that's just the first piece of it, because the other part of it, the summers do matter. And so if it gets too hot in the summer, too dry, too wet, that may be why someone is saying that peach trees won't survive. Maybe your mother's in an area that's extremely wet, gets a lot of rain in Tennessee, and has a clay soil. And so the soil stays saturated through most of the year. And I would imagine that peach trees probably wouldn't thrive in an environment like that. So start off by checking out the zone, and don't be surprised if some of those big box stores are selling plants that will not survive your zone. And that's what I've seen. In my zone 5 area, and this whole area is zone 5, for probably 100 miles around, we're all zone 5. Well, we find often plants at these garden centers for zone 6, zone 7, zone 8. I saw some of this last year with some ornamental grasses with big signs saying, liven up your landscape, and they're selling these beautiful grasses of all colors. And then you look at the tag and it's a zone 7 or zone 5 or zone 8 grass. Well, I'd love to liven up my landscape with those grasses, but you have to treat them as an annual plant because they're not going to survive a harsh winter. And so I won't say they're always right or they're always wrong, but the stores often will try to sell you plants that are not suitable for your specific garden space, because it might be a regional center. They might be buying plants from the next state over that is in a higher zone, and then they just ship the truck to all of the Lowe's or Home Depots or whatever, and then start selling the plants. And no one at the store is actually making an effort to make sure that they match. So it really comes down to you making that effort when you buy a plant or a tree to make sure it matches your garden. So there's a couple ideas of why maybe she's been told that a peach tree won't survive. Like most of our gardens, if she wants to grow a peach tree, there's a peach tree out there that she can grow. It just might take a little bit of extra homework to find the right variety that can handle the soil, that can handle the winter temperatures, and can handle the summer temperatures. Girl by the Brook is saying, any tips for starting garlic in spring? Just do it. And so the key point about growing garlic in spring versus growing garlic in fall, the garlic cloves need cold temperatures to form into bulbs. And so Jason, a really good gardening buddy of mine, grows a lot of garlic in spring, but they will never form the big garlic bulbs. And instead, he's growing them a lot like green onions or like scallions, where he's growing the garlic to grow and then be used in a very similar manner, because it's not going to be the big bulb loaded with cloves. Instead, it's going to be a beautiful green plant that looks a lot like a green onion. And so the clove will grow and give you a nice garlic plant, and then you harvest it anytime in the summer or fall and use it like a green onion. You chop it up, you use it in a saute. There's lots of things you can do with it, but it won't develop all of those cloves that you can then use in your cooking. To develop those cloves, you need to put in your garlic in fall, let it overwinter, and then harvest it in late summer, and you'll get lots of big bulbs with the cloves in it. But as far as spring planting, go for it. Just don't be surprised when you harvest to see that it's a beautiful green plant, and you should actually harvest it while it's still green so that you can use it. Most of the time when we harvest our garlic, we wait until the outer leaves turn brown and then start falling onto the surface. That's when we harvest the garlic that was planted in fall. But for spring planted garlic, you really do want to harvest it while the whole plant is green, because you will be using all of the leaves of that plant. So hope that helps out. Okay, Big B, the fluffy redneck, is saying, would it be better to spread my compost across all my plants I grow, or would it be better to heavy use it on stuff like watermelons and corn, heavy feeders? It depends on how much compost you have. And so I haven't had my new garden for long, and so I haven't developed a lot of compost yet. And so I do limit where I put my compost. And yes, I do put most of my compost in an area with heavy feeders. I'll be growing some popcorn this year, and I'll be growing some big pumpkins and melons. That's where I'll be focusing my homemade compost because I don't have a lot of it. If you have enough, spread it everywhere. That's the main tenet of Charles Dowding's no dig gardening is he makes literally tons of compost every year. And so he's able to spread 2 to 3 inches of compost over his entire garden. If you have that much compost, then definitely spread it over everything. But if you're limited, then do try to highlight those plants or the soil, actually. If you've got an area with soil that hasn't been amended and needs more organic matter, then that's where you should focus the compost that you do have. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Hot Pepper Paul, thanks for that. 250 watching, but only 70 likes. Hit the like button and go for it. Hit the like button. That definitely shows YouTube and all the rest of the world that you guys are benefiting from this. So thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate it. Okay, let's see. Rachel saying, I planted my garlic in the spring. Then I learned about the need to overwinter. I harvested and replanted it in the fall, and it's doing well. There you go. And so it all really comes down to what you're trying to get from your garlic as to when you grow it and then how you choose to use it. M70 says, my sweet peas were killed by an unusual heat pattern in winter in Central Florida. Could I have prevented the damage by throwing something over them to protect them? So good question. And that's also one of the things I want to talk about today. And so in my Saturday video, I talked a little bit about controlling the weather, how we really can't control the weather, but by learning some of these techniques of how weather impacts us, we can learn to protect our garden when the weather hits, particularly the bad weather. So yes, there are a number of things to do. So for some of us that are in colder regions, or like I do, where we have severe thunderstorms, then we need to protect our plant from the cold conditions and from storms like that. So we'll use plastic over hoops to warm up the plants to get them growing in early spring, and we'll use hailcloth over our plants to protect them from some of the devastating storms. And so for those of you that are in hot regions, you do the same basic thing. You put something over your plants to protect them. And for Florida, I would say that's where shade cloth comes in. And if you start looking into shade cloth, it's really pretty fascinating how they develop this material. You can buy shade cloth, excuse me, in many different ratios as to how much sun will be blocked and how much gets in. So you can buy 10% shade cloth, 20% shade cloth, up to 50 or 60% shade cloth. And that tells you how much sun is being blocked. And so if you know that you have this problem, and this gets back to the general theme today, where you've been tracking your weather, if you know that there's a particular time of year when the sun is extremely harsh and it's extremely hot and your plants suffer, well, then start thinking about it now and prepare the hoops or some type of trellis system that's going to support this covering. And then in the summer, it's a shade cloth that you use. And there's some experience that comes in with it. You might start with a 30% shade cloth so that most of the sun is getting through, and you'll probably see some pretty good results or better results. But if you still have those problems where the plants get too hot or they get too much sun, now you might want to move up to a 50% shade cloth where it's blocking out more of the sun's energy and more of that heat. And so, yes, there's definitely things that we can all do to protect our plants based on the weather that we're encountering. It might be plastic, it might be hailcloth, it might be shade cloth. It can also be other plants. And so that's one of those things I suggest you experiment with, because tall plants will protect and help shade smaller plants. And you can actually set up your garden that way, where you might have trees or shrubs along one end of the garden and let them protect the garden space behind in the heat of summer. And so during the spring, if your yard is set up this way, you might be able to put plants in that get full sun. But then later in the year, based on the trees starting to set out their leaves, now the trees will be shading that spot. That's one of those really cool things. I've got a video coming up about this here for the equinox next week, where I'll be talking about mapping out the sun and the shade in your garden. And this is one of the things you can really use to your advantage. If there's an area that gets sun early in the season so that your plants can get off to a really good start, but then is shaded later in the summer when the sun is harshest, you can really use that and grow some plants that like the cooler conditions but don't like the hot summer conditions. And then, of course, vice versa. You might have an area that is shaded early in the season where you start your plants, and then as the summer progresses, that area moves into full sun, and you put plants in that area that will benefit from the full sun. So start thinking about those kind of things. And that's why I say keep track of what your weather is doing, because it changes from month to month, week to week, day to day, hour by hour. The weather is going to change. And weather is different than climate. So climate is a long-term identification of the general weather patterns that your area will have. So a region has a climate that might be Mediterranean, where the winters aren't too harsh, the summers aren't too strong, and it's kind of moderate temperatures overall. We call that a Mediterranean climate, but there are many other names for different regions. You can have an area that's extremely cold, extremely dry, extremely wet. Those are climates. But within the climate is the weather, the day-to-day events of what's happening. The clouds, the rain, the snowstorms, the hailstorms, the wind. That's your weather. And that's what I want you to focus on in the next gardening season, is how does that change on a day-to-day basis? How does it change monthly? How does it change seasonally? And when you start realizing the weather patterns within your garden, you might understand a little bit more about the climate, but you'll also be able to identify the seeds and the plants to grow and the timing as to how this all fits in with your garden. So we'll get to a little bit more of that as we're progressing. Let's see what other kind of questions we have. Yeah, the Mrs. Marvel is saying shade is a necessary tool in the desert. It's one more way to prolong the season, but by peak summer, just about everything struggles. And yeah, and I've said this before, my brother lives in southern Arizona, and where I'll be using plastic to warm up the soil as we move into summer, he's using shade, like the Mrs. Marvel, to cool down the soil moving into the summer. And so for many of us, summer is peak growing season. But if you live in the southwest of the United States, summer is a time that you're not growing in your garden. And that gets to climate in general, but this is specifically how the weather impacts your garden. And your summer may be too hot, too dry, too harsh to have a vegetable garden. And once you realize that, now you could use it to your advantage. I've had so many questions from new gardeners in areas like that, where the summer is just too hot, and they're asking why they can't grow a certain plant, or why their plants die, or why the leaves are turning brown. Well, it's because that plant isn't suitable for that particular garden. It's too hot. And so you just learn to not grow those plants in that time of year. And that holds true throughout the entire year based on where it is that you happen to live. So, okay, let's see what we have. Lots of good stuff going back and forth. Rachel's saying basil is a good shade plant for soil. Yeah, I love growing basil. And I'm planning, I've probably mentioned this before. I think I've got 6 or 7 varieties of basil that I'll be growing. And one of the reasons I'm growing a lot of basil is to do a future video where I show how basil grows in full sun, how basil grows in shade, and give you an idea of how to grow basil in different areas of the garden, because basil is one of those plants that is really susceptible to some of those drastic changes in temperature and sun. So hopefully I'll get that video done this year and you'll be able to see basil in particular. Maytao is asking what kind of plastic to warm up the soil. So you can approach plastic from a couple different perspectives. And so when I have a bed or a garden area, even in the ground, if I'm going to be putting in some shrubs, for instance, or perennial plants, and the ground is too cold, but I know the plants are coming or I already have the plants, I'll put down a black plastic sheet directly on the soil for the purpose of warming up the soil. And it only needs to be there for a couple days to really see some dramatic increases in soil. I don't keep it there long term because then it can start killing some of the soil organisms. So it's just enough to warm up the soil. I'll use a black plastic directly on the soil. For most of my garden beds where I want the whole environment to be warm, not just the soil. So then I'll warm up the soil and then I'll put the plants in and I'll keep the environment warm. That's when I use a clear or opaque plastic. And the plastic over hoops in that situation does work to warm the soil to a certain degree, but it's really more suitable for maintaining the heat. So during the day, the sun will shine through the plastic into that bed. And then the key point with an opaque plastic in particular, that's most of what I use, is at night, now the soil starts radiating some of that heat from the day, and it can't escape. The plastic is holding that air from the warm soil within that environment. And so the bed and the air within the bed is warmer because of using a clear plastic as opposed to a black plastic. So it depends on how you choose to use it, whether it's short-term or long-term, as to what type of plastic that you want to use. And I've, believe it or not, I have used plastic and then thrown shade cloth over it. If it's a bed that, like this time of year for me, I mentioned all the snow, I'm trying to warm up the bed to be ready to plant in a couple weeks. I'll have the plastic over it and I'll just leave the plastic sealed all day long. But if we have one of these weird days where it gets extremely hot, like we've been the last couple of days, there's a couple choices. You can either go out and open up the plastic to cool it off so it doesn't get too hot, or I find it easier since I've got pre-cut sheets of shade cloth. I'll just go out and throw shade cloth over the plastic. That way I can just leave it all sealed up. So there's all kinds of fun things you can experiment with and combine some of these different techniques and methods to get to soil the temperature you like and to keep your plants nice and happy. So Linda Hardwick saying beautiful background flowers. Thank you for that. And so let's point out that this is a picture from Linda Davidson. And so thank you, Linda. Some pictures of the sunflowers behind me today. And I think those are Tithonia, the orange sunflowers. Beautiful plant. I'm planning on growing a lot of those this year as well. And so Linda sent this picture to me a while back. And so she's the background of the day. And especially if you are new to the live stream and you want to have your garden or your gardening picture as one of my backdrops, go ahead and send it to me. You can send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com and I'll add it to the queue and plan to show it at some point in the future. And so this is a beautiful picture. I wish I had sunflowers like this right now growing in my garden, but it's coming. And I just yesterday was doing a little bit more research, pulling out some of my seed packets, because I'll be doing a video in a couple months about sunflowers and how to grow sunflowers, different types of sunflowers, the benefits of sunflowers. I love sunflowers in the garden, and I'm going to be growing a ton of sunflowers this year. And so I really like this picture because it's one of my favorite plants. So thank you for that, Linda. Cherie saying, well, I need to remove any fruit if it forms this year on my new pear tree. You probably won't get any fruit in the first year, and you probably won't get any fruit in the second year. And in the third year, you might start getting some fruit on a brand new tree, and it's up to you. There are a lot of gardeners out there that will recommend you remove the first fruit that you get on a fruit tree. But I say, because it's taken years to get to that point, you should already have ample root development. You should thin the fruits. And so for pears and apples and plums and peaches, you really don't want to keep all of the fruit that forms. Often it's going to be too heavy for the branch and could damage the branch. A lot of fruit will also give you a lot of little fruit. And so pruning out some of the fruit clusters is always a good idea. But that first year I get fruit on my fruit trees, I let them grow because it's been years to reach that point. And even if it's only 1 or 2 pears or 1 or 2 apples or whatever the type of tree is, I let it grow until I reach harvest. And there's just something special about eating that very first fruit on your tree. So if you get fruit this year, I would say go ahead and prune it off. That would be highly unusual, but you won't have ample root development yet. Put all of the plant's energy into growing roots and making the tree stronger. But when it comes and the plant is strong enough, it's always good to just enjoy it yourself, regardless of what all the experts tell you to do. If you see fruit and you want to grow the fruit, eat the fruit. You know, it's the same with tomato plants. When you buy a tomato plant at the garden center, a lot of gardeners want to buy those plants that already have flowers on them, already have some little tomatoes developing, then they transplant them in the garden and they'll leave the flowers and they'll leave the fruit. And the plant will do okay. It's recommended that you pluck off those flowers when you transplant because transplanting is a stressful event and the plant is trying to send out new roots in its new spot and it's trying to send energy up to the flowers. And generally, when the plant is stressed, it's going to focus more of its attention on the flowers and the fruiting. And so if you transplant a tomato or any plant that is already flowering, you will reduce the amount of root growth because the plant is putting energy into that fruit or flower. That's why it's recommended to go ahead and prune those off. But especially if you live in an area that doesn't have a long season, or if you're new to gardening, there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. You can leave the plant, the flowers on the plant. You can leave that fruit to develop and then see what happens. The plant may not grow as well as it could if you prune those flowers and fruit off, but it's still going to grow. It's still going to give you a harvest, even if it's a reduced harvest, and you'll have fruit earlier than if you wait for the time of new flowers developing after you've plucked off all the flowers at transplanting. So I really try to avoid the blanket statements of what you should prune and shouldn't prune. If you are getting enjoyment out of it, just go ahead and let your plants grow and you'll learn from it. That this year you were able to harvest tomatoes early, but they were small tomatoes, maybe not a lot of them. Next year, try pruning off all those blossoms at transplant time, and you may see the plant becomes vigorous much earlier and ends up giving you more tomatoes that are bigger. But just do it the way you want to do it and have fun with it. That's the way I like to look at it. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Masabi Gal saying, are there plants that don't like Nicoliana plants? I've heard tomatoes and peppers are affected badly by them. So Nicoliana plants have a chemical in them that can harm some of the plants growing nearby. And so it depends on the plant that are growing that as to what the effect might be. Generally, I don't plant things like that near my peppers and tomatoes. I tend to keep my tomatoes and my peppers and my squashes in areas of the garden where they have dedicated beds. Even, if I'm intermatching them, that's okay. But that's probably what you're thinking about, because there are a lot of the more tender plants that might be affected if you are growing them side by side. Sturdier plants like the tomatoes will be affected, but the tomato plant is already growing and strong. You shouldn't see too big of an impact, but I would put the Nicoliana separately, put them around the beds of your vegetables and then let them flower, and they can actually have some pretty good benefits for the insects in your garden. So hope that helps out. Pauline Stewart's asking, do all fruit trees need to have a net to protect it from the birds? It depends. It depends on the tree and it depends on your birds. Most birds are going to be eating insects during the nesting phase. And then after that nesting phase, the birds tend to specialize. So some birds are seed eaters, and they're really not going to do much in the way of fruit. So it depends on what kind of birds you have. So learn about your birds. And then there are other birds that really like the fruit, but they might prefer berries over an apple or a pear. And so again, learn about the bird, because that may influence whether you need netting at all. And then the other aspect of it is the type of fruit you're growing and when it ripens. In my experience, I've learned that birds do not eat unripe fruit. Generally, they're going to wait until the fruit ripens. Then they're going to attack the tree. And so you might not need bird netting at all if you just learn to harvest a little bit early before the fruit is completely ripe. And that way you can beat the birds to the harvest. I've mentioned this in previous live streams where I had a tree and it was just absolutely beautiful, growing well, and it reached the point where I was just getting ready to harvest, and this has happened with my grapes as well. And I thought, okay, tomorrow I'm going to come out and harvest this tree because I know the fruit will be perfect. And I came out the next day and all the fruit had been eaten. There wasn't much on it, but the birds knew when it was ripe as well. So I have since learned to try to harvest my plants a little bit early, the fruits, before those birds that might eat the ripe fruit come and devastate the tree. If you aren't attuned to your garden and your trees, then pretty much any of the fruit trees that your birds are going to be eating need to have nets over them. So many different factors, type of bird, what kind of foods they eat, when you harvest your fruit. But it's one of those things, if you are thinking you might be delayed or you just want to be sure, then go ahead and throw bird netting over it, and that's going to be your safest bet. So Tasha Rucker, hi to you. I'm glad you caught the live stream today too. That's great. Claudia says, has a flock of cedar waxwings that come and eat all the blossoms off the apple tree. And there's another consideration. That's a good one, Claudia. We often talk about putting bird netting over to protect our fruit, but you can also put bird netting over your tree to protect the blossoms, because there are insects and birds that will get in and disrupt the pollination or flat out eat the blossom. And so it's okay, definitely okay to put bird netting over your tree when they're blooming, because that may give you a harvest if you protect the blossoms, and otherwise you might not. So thanks for that. That's a really good point to point out. Okay, let's see what we have. Rhonda saying, I was wondering if you remove fall mulch before warming the soil with plastic, will the mulch prevent soil warming up? Yeah, that's a good question. If you mulch, especially with a lot of mulch, the mulch will moderate the soil temperature. And that's great in summer when it's too hot. The mulch will help keep the soil moderately cool. But the opposite holds true as well. If you live in an area with very cold winters like I do, where the soil is frozen, then the mulch will actually moderate that soil temperature, which means it will hinder the warm up period. And so, and you can see this in the video that I did recently on Saturday. I have mulch on some of my beds, but I've actually pulled off the straw mulch on some of my other beds to start warming up during these warm days. And in another few weeks, I'll start putting plastic over those beds. And so without the mulch, the beds will warm up faster in spring. That is the way it tends to work. If you're not in a rush and you're also like me, that's why I've left the mulch on some of the beds, where I want some of that straw to enrich the soil as the spring progresses, then I'll leave that mulch in place. But if you're getting ready to plant and you realize that your soil temperature is too cold, pull back the mulch, move it to another bed, put it in some bags to be used later, let the soil warm up, put the plants in, and then you can add the mulch later on. So good question. I appreciate that. Okay, let's see what we have. Ancient Gardening, thank you so much for what you're saying today. I see a lot of your advice passing back and forth, so that's awesome. Growing with Donnie is saying, what is the best to combine with worm castings to fertilize my container garden? I've added bone meal already. And so it gets down to what your plant is deficient in. And so bone meal is a phosphorus fertilizer. And if you need nitrogen, more nitrogen, you might consider a blood meal. And so worm castings have a slight nitrogen component in addition to the wonderful microbial growth that they're adding to a pot. But it is one of those things you have to look at your plants. I don't usually recommend a soil test for potted plants just because it changes so often with the soilless mixes we're using in our pots. But my guess is even with the worm castings, you're probably going to need some nitrogen fertilizer. And so blood meal is one of those things that you could use for that. Look at other alternatives. I have a video where I talk about using my comfrey tea. You can also use kelp. Fish emulsion. There's a lot of other things that are organic and you can use in your pots as well. Do try to keep it balanced, keep an eye on your plant, and try to avoid adding too much because too much fertilizer can be as bad as not enough. So I usually add a little bit at a time, and I use my worm castings primarily for my potting soil as I'm up potting plants. But it's definitely something you can add to all the other potted plants that you're growing. So, okay, let's see. Just had another one pop by. Luz Robles is saying, I looked into the video library but didn't see a video yet on how one might revitalize sunburned soil. Can you discuss this today? And so, in general, if you've got a soil problem, organic matter is the way to fix it. And so a sunburned soil that's been beat on by the sun, and all that radiation has killed the microorganisms in the top couple inches. Amend with organic matter. That's compost, aged manure, crushed leaves. There's so many things you can add as amendment. And then I would put a mulch on top of it because obviously that's an area that gets a lot of sun and that's what probably caused the damage in the first place. So amend the soil with organic matter and then put mulch on top to keep the soil protected from that point forward. And that's really one of the best ways to really keep your soil alive and healthy and avoid being sunburned again. Okay, so Lily, it's asking, is making compost tea better than using unfinished compost? And so it depends. And there's so much about gardening that depends on the reason you're doing it. And so compost tea is most often used as a fertilizer or as a foliar spread to help reduce some fungal diseases. And it tends to be a temporary thing. And so now if you think about it, your compost is loaded with bacteria and nutrients. And so if you take that compost and soak it in a bunch of water, and especially if you run the air bubbles through it so it's oxygenated, you're going to boost the bacterial activity within that liquid. But at the same time, you're going to be diluting the nutrients in that liquid because the compost itself is packed with nutrients. But when you add it to water as a tea, you're diluting those nutrients throughout the liquid. And so you'll have an increase in bacteria, you'll have a decrease in nutrients. And so when you pour that on your plants, that bacterial action is what tends to thwart some of the fungal growth that might be happening on your leaves. The nutrients are diluted, so it's really not adding a lot to your soil. The bacteria, as soon as you pour the tea on your soil, some of those bacteria will survive, but just like we were talking about, the sun is going to kill a lot of that bacteria that is in that liquid that's on the surface of your bed. And so I'm not a big fan of compost tea because I see no reason to dilute the nutrients. I don't have that many fungal problems. And to take all that effort to boost the bacterial growth and then kill the bacteria by just pouring it onto the soil seems to me a bit of a waste of time. And so I prefer instead, if you're thinking about making compost tea or using compost tea for its nutrient value, go ahead and use compost as a mulch. Because now every time you water and every time it rains, you're going to have that water percolate down through that compost, and it's going to carry those nutrients down into your soil, just as if you had a watering can filled with compost tea. But now it won't be as diluted because you're dealing with a couple inches of compost on top of your soil. So that addition of nutrients will be longer lived, where it's going to be occurring over weeks and months every time you water and it rains. So that's the way I prefer to use my compost, is as a mulch if I've got enough of it. If I don't have enough, then that's when I'll work it into the soil to get the soil improved first, and I'll use other mulches like straw. I love the straw mulch. And then when I reach the point where my soil's nice and rich and I have more compost, that's what I do. I put the compost on top and let nature add the compost tea, the dilution, the extract, because it's really an extract of compost when you put the water through it from that point forward. So that's how I view compost tea and how I use it. Okay, let's see what we have. So Bettina is suggesting a Kim stage 52. If you put @Gardner Scott in front of your question, I'm much more likely to see it, because you've probably already seen there's a lot of stuff flowing past. It's hard for me to see all that, but if you put @Gardner Scott in front of it, then it shows up orange for me, and I'm much more likely to see it. Like Prepper Chris's question, did you know we're going to have a bad cicada invasion this year? So I didn't know that. Chris lives on the other side of the country from me, and so cicadas are an incredible insect, and there are a number of different types of cicadas. But depending on where you live, it is a cyclical event. And this is another one of those things for your garden journal, especially if you're getting started out and you have the cicadas that are popping up this year. Make note of that, because depending on what kind of cicada they are, it might be 7 years before those cicadas return. And so if you know you've got 7-year cicadas, sure, this year you're going to have that infestation. That's just the way it works. But during this season, they're going to emerge, they're going to devastate gardens, they're going to mate, they're going to lay their eggs, and then the larvae won't emerge and become adults for 7 years. I think there are cicadas that are actually 13-year cicadas. So it all depends on the specific type of cicada. But no, Chris, I didn't know that you were lined up for that. But it's very regional, and it really is determined by the type of insect and your area. And this gets us back to the weather, because they will emerge when the soil temperature reaches a certain point. And so this is one of those things that you can learn for your specific area about what the temperatures are needed and start observing that. And you can probably forecast within a few days, I would imagine, for the next cicada event. You know when they're coming based on how you garden. You keep track of your soil temperature, you're keeping track of your weather. And so if you know the cicadas are about to emerge, now you put protection over your plants. You put a row cover over your plants, or you put plastic, or you cover the entire bed with a shade cloth so that the cicadas can't get in and eat your plants. And it's a relatively short period of time that they're going through all the mating. And so if you can protect your plants during that brief period of time, they might have minimal impact on your garden. But that's definitely something to add to your list of things to learn more about, is cicadas and those cyclical insects that don't come every single year. So let's see, Tamara's saying there's a 6-year-old named Eric that joined this live chat, and is growing a garden. Hi, Eric. I haven't seen your comments yet, but that's awesome. I'm so glad that you're here today to listen, and I hope you have a fantastic garden this year, Eric. That's just incredible. Okay, Kim Stage 52. Can you explain what type of mulch to use in my garden pots? And so it depends on the plant again. And so if you're growing a plant that likes a lot of warmth, and so for instance, pots where I'm growing the plants like yarrow and echinacea and some of those perennial plants that really like the growth. There's a lot of hens and chicks, the Cyprivivum. They do well with a gravel mulch. So a mulch that will actually reflect and hold some heat around those plants that like the heat. So there's one option. If it's a basic plant that you're growing like petunias or other type of annuals, then I'll mulch with crushed leaves. I keep the leaves from the fall, and so in my pots I'll just crush leaves and I'll use those as a mulch around a lot of the annuals that I put into my pots. If it's a bigger pot and you're growing a fruit tree or some other type of bush or shrub or perennial grasses and flowers that will come back, then I'll tend to use a wood chip or bark mulch, because those are plants that are coming back every year. I'm not doing a lot to change out the soil in those pots. And so I use an organic mulch that lasts a little bit longer, like bark. And that's a mulch that I can just keep that decorative plant in some corner of my landscape, keep it watered, and that bark mulch or wood chip mulch tends to do pretty well. So a lot of it depends on the size of the pot and the type of plant and whether you're mulching organically so you can add some of those nutrients. And that's one reason why I use the wood chip mulch in the big pots around those perennial and fruiting shrubs and trees, is because you want that material to be breaking down and improve the soil. And similarly, why I use the crushed leaves around the annuals, because in the pots where I'm growing annuals, I'm going to be reusing that soil for the next year. So I'll put the potting soil in the pot, I'll put my annuals in, I'll mulch with something like the crushed leaves. And then at the end of the season, when I'm cleaning up those pots, well, those crushed leaves now become part of the soil, and over the winter they'll start breaking down and help improve the soil for the next year. And so that's one way that you can just keep reusing your potting soil in your pots, is by using organic mulches. But for some of those others that like the heat, it's gravel, and I like to use colored gravel, the really fine gravel, to keep those pots warm. So I hope that helps out a little bit. So let's get back to the weather theme for the day and one way to think about it. And so in my career as an Air Force pilot, I learned a lot about weather. It's not surprising, I think, to you that pilots need to know about weather, because it's not a good idea to fly your airplane into clouds that could be hazardous to you and everybody else on the airplane. And so we were taught a lot about weather. And so it's almost second nature for me. I have to really stop and think about you and most gardeners out there that haven't received that education that I received. And I can look at clouds, I can look at patterns, and for me, it's easy to understand, and I garden accordingly. Well, that's why I wanted to take this time to share this idea with you, because it's second nature for me, but it's a development over years and years of observing the weather from a pilot's perspective. It is different on the ground in my garden. And so while I can discern certain weather patterns, I have to take the time as well to figure out how my garden is different from the surrounding area and how the forecast will really affect me. And so when I see a forecast, particularly in the fall as the weather's starting to change and the temperatures are starting to get colder, if I see a long-range forecast that says the frost is going to hit in 5 days, well, in my garden, I can expect that the frost is probably going to hit a couple days earlier than that because of my higher elevation. And so I'll put protection around my plants. I'll plan my gardening activities a few days in advance of what other gardeners in my area are doing, because I just learned that that's one of the ways that I need to garden. I also know that I'm going to be hit by hailstorms in the summer. And so if I'm on the ball, I've got my hail cloth ready, or I've got the shade cloth ready, or I've got the plastic ready. I've got something ready to cover my plants if I know the hail is coming. And that's part of the forecast. But again, the forecast is for the primary center of the city. It's not for an outlier like me. And so there were many days this last year where my daughter, Kiri, who lives in town, would have a forecast and then an actual event of hail or thunderstorms appearing. And she's calling me or sending a picture and saying, look how much water we've got from this rainfall. And I didn't have any rain at all. We're about 10, 11 miles apart from each other. They're being devastated by water and I'm not, and vice versa. And that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Look at the patterns within your garden as to how the weather develops. I live just to the east of the Rocky Mountains. Much of our weather rolls off the mountains. And so I can look at the wind patterns and get an idea of whether a storm is going to be strong or not based on the direction of the wind. And this comes from experience. It comes from observation. It comes from actually keeping track of these type of things and how they're influencing the garden. I know, as do many of the others that live in my area, that when certain weather systems set up in a certain way, we're going to have an impact in the way the weather hits our garden. So that's what's happening this weekend. We call it a four corners low. And so we have a low pressure system that's coming in from the Pacific Ocean, and it's going to set up over the four corners. And so that's the corner of Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico. Where they meet is the four corners. And when a low pressure system sets up over the four corners and then just sits there for a day or two, well, now it's pulling up the moisture from the Gulf of Baja in Mexico. It's still winter for us. And so we have the cold air that's coming down from Canada. We have this low pressure that comes in from the Pacific Ocean. We have the moisture coming up from the Gulf of Baja. And that means we're going to be hit hard with a lot of snow. The first year I moved here, 24 years ago, we had an 18-inch storm, 18 inches of snow in a one-day period from a pattern that set up like this. So I know now, having lived here for a while and tracking these kind of things, that when we have a four-corner low set up in late winter and early spring, we're going to get pounded by snow. So that's the kind of stuff that you can start looking for. What are the weather patterns that are seasonal, that are annual, that happen regularly within your area and have an influence on what you can grow and what's going to happen within your garden specifically? And it helps to talk to gardeners, the old gardeners that have been living in your area for a long time. Talk to them and find out the type of information that they use as they see the weather developing through the year. I know we have the four corners low in the spring. After that point, it's not an issue anymore. In the summer, we still have four corner lows set up, but there's no snow associated with it because we don't have the cold air coming down from Canada. And so it's not as easy as to say this weather pattern will have this influence on my garden. It's this weather pattern in spring has this particular influence on my garden. And this weather pattern in summer has a different influence on my garden. And it's fascinating. I love the study of weather because if you start putting all these pieces together, you start seeing how they impact your garden. The two big ones we have in the United States are El Nino and La Nina, which are weather patterns that are formed based on the water temperature in the Pacific Ocean and where that warm water is situated. And sometimes we'll have La Ninas or El Ninos that will set up for 2 or 3 years of weather impact. Well, when you start understanding what that really means, now you can start analyzing what's happening within your garden. And so you may have a couple really good years in your garden. And then suddenly the next year, everything's dying, nothing's growing right. It could be that you've had a shift from El Nino to La Nina, or vice versa. Those are some of the things that many gardeners don't even think about. You think you're doing something wrong. You think it's a pest. You think it's something that you have no control over. And in some respects, you don't have control over it. But when you recognize what is happening, now you can give yourself some control. You can give yourself control with those things we've been talking about, the plastic, the shade cloth, the hail cloth, your selection of plants, the timing of your planting. All of that can be traced back to weather patterns that are happening, and yours are different than mine. So I give you the example of Four Corners low, but I'm guessing there's something in your area that sets up. The New England states of the United States as well have the nor'easters that set up. And it's the same kind of thing. You can see a nor'easter coming because you'll have the system rolling across the middle of the United States, and then it kind of twists up off the coast of the United States, and then suddenly parks there and starts bringing in all the wind from the northeast. And there can be some devastating storms as a result of the nor'easter pattern setting up. Well, tie that into your gardening and recognize how it's influencing the plants you're growing and you. And I bet you over time, because it does develop with time and experience, you'll be able to have a more successful garden. It's because you are acknowledging how the weather impacts. So that's the big message I wanted to get out to you today. There's still a lot more information to come, but that was the theme that I hope you can start adding to your bag of tricks for gardening, is focusing on the weather and then learning how it influences you. Hot Pepper Paul is saying hurricanes. And yes, in Florida, you've got hurricanes to contend with, but you know roughly when the hurricane season is. And you know, based on experience, if you've been growing peppers in Florida for any time, what kind of impact that's going to have on your garden. And you might be able to construct some protection for your garden. Or you might just accept that if a hurricane's going to hit, then it's going to cause some damage. And Florida got hit pretty well. My son lives in Louisiana. Louisiana just got nailed by hurricanes this last year. And a lot of gardeners down there basically had to throw their hands up when you had back-to-back hurricanes that devastated everything. That doesn't happen every year, but it is the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. Keeping track of those severe weather events, but more importantly, the day-to-day weather events when it comes to your gardening. Rachel's saying we had a freak cold snap in mid-June last year that dropped the temps from 80 degrees Fahrenheit to daytime temps in the 60s. And that's about 26 degrees Celsius down to about 15 degrees Celsius. And tomatoes were angry, absolutely. And I showed that in some of my videos last year where we had some freak storms like that. We had a freak storm in September that dropped the temperature well below freezing and effectively killed everything in my fall garden. It was so unusual. It had never happened before, but it happened, and I kept track of it. This year, I'm going to be a little more conservative with some of my planting, late planting, just in case we get another cold snap like that. But it may never happen again, but it will influence how you garden. Julie Marshall says, well done, Gardener Scott. Thank you. UK sub, great to have you here watching from the UK. Love watching about gardening. I have an allotment. Is now the best time to move my asparagus bed? I had trouble with beetles the last 2 years. And so the best time to move an asparagus bed is when the plants are dormant. So I'm guessing, just based on some conversations I've had with people I know in the UK, I'm guessing your plants are still dormant. And so, yes, if they're dormant, I would say now would be a great time to move your asparagus. Even if they've just started to sprout, you can still move them. It's not usually a good idea to move an actively growing plant. So in late winter, early spring, that's typically the time most of us are planting asparagus or starting to move our asparagus. So if your soil is warm enough that you can work in it, you shouldn't be digging up in frozen soil. Or if the soil is saturated, you really shouldn't be digging in saturated soil. You can really hurt, even destroy the structure of your soil when you're working in that. But if your soil can be worked and the plants are dormant, I say go for it. It can definitely be a nice time. And if you can find a spot where they're not going to be devastated by beetles, that's great. I would also encourage, and I've talked about this in videos and live streams as well, trying to get an entire system going up. I know it's harder in an allotment system, but if you can find out what kind of beetles they are that are affecting your asparagus, you might be able to learn about a predatory wasp or some type of other insect that might eat the beetle larva if they're actually living in your soil or somewhere in your allotment. And you might be able to plant some herbs or some flowers or some grasses within your allotment space that would attract some of these other insects that might eat your beetles. So there's a whole nother area to start looking into. I love the idea of attracting beneficial insects to deal with some of the harmful pests that we have. But if you're looking to move, now may be a good time for you. So thanks for asking that question. So Tanya's saying, love this live. Gardener Scott, thanks, Tanya. I appreciate you being here. How do you stay on top of slugs in the garden? And so this gets back to some of the things that eat slugs. So I encourage birds in my garden. I also encourage other wildlife because though I don't have a lot of frogs or toads and frogs are great at dealing with some of the slugs. And so part of it is just developing that balanced system between the animals and the insects, and they'll help keep things under control. That's one way of doing it. And like for the slugs, for instance, I know that there are some of the smaller animals that we don't normally like to have in our garden, but even rabbits and gophers will take care of some of the slug problem you have. But more importantly, the best way I've found for dealing with the slugs is to trap them. The biggest area I have a slug problem is with my strawberries. And so when I'm growing the strawberries in ground beds, I have a slug problem. And so I'll put a rolled up newspaper or wet cardboard down on the ground, and that's a good trap, easy trap that I've found for the slugs is to have something like wet cardboard. The slugs are going to crawl under that at night, and then I go out in the morning, lift up the cardboard, and there might be 6 or 7 slugs, and then I deal with them at that point by moving them into a compost pile after they've been killed, dunking them in water. There's lots of methods to actually kill them, but that's one way to collect the slugs at that point. And then another solution, and that I do more of this, is to actually grow in raised beds. And so I have a drier area, and so the wood in my raised beds tends to stay dry on the outside, which doesn't make it inviting to slugs. So I have not seen slugs crawling up my dry wood beds to get to my plants. And so there's an option to reduce the slug problem as well, is to grow in raised beds, to trap them, and then to encourage some of those animals that might be eating the slugs. Those are the primary ways that I tend to deal with them. Okay, let's see what else we have popping up. Ducks, there you go. Yeah, thanks, Paul. I knew ducks were one of those things that love slugs, and I should have mentioned them as well. So I know gardeners in this area that have a duck or two, and they let them in their garden occasionally to eat the slugs. And then they pull the ducks out so they don't destroy the rest of the garden. But there's definitely something that you can do. So, Salty Soldier, Bettina saying, highly recommend binge watching my videos. That's awesome. I try to set up my videos, as many of you know, so that they flow and they follow a pattern of the calendar and what events should be taking place. And so some of the videos that I'm planning on doing the next couple weeks, I might have a similar video from a year ago or 2 years ago. And so, yeah, if there's a topic that you're looking for, binge watch some of my videos from a year ago, and it may fit with the time frame within your garden right now. I just did my 250th video. That was the one that came out on Saturday. So thanks for saying that, Bettina, because I do have a lot of videos in the garden. And the way YouTube works is it suggests to you the videos that you are most likely to watch based on your search and your watching patterns. And so you may or may not be recommended a video of mine or someone else that you like to watch their videos as well. But that doesn't mean we don't have videos that you will benefit from. And some of my favorite videos, some of the videos I think are among my best, are not my highest performing videos. And so you're not going to be recommended some of those videos. But if you start doing the binge watching, you might discover some of that information you didn't even know was in my library. So I'll even binge watch some of my own videos from time to time to remind myself what I've got in the library so that I'm not repeating myself if I can avoid it. So thanks for that suggestion. I think that's great. Okay, let's go ahead and get to that part of the show. I know a lot of you look forward to where I discuss some of my thoughts, some of my philosophies, and how I approach gardening in general. And so this one, it sounds a little unusual, but of course I'll explain it. And so the way I approach gardening is to plan for the unplanned events. And so that's one reason why I wanted to talk about weather today, is because weather is often unplanned. Those freezes and those hurricanes and those thunderstorms happen at the worst possible time, it seems. We can't plan for when it's going to happen, but we can plan for the possibility that it is going to happen. And so all the stuff we've been talking about so far is part of that, where you plan for the unplanned. You suspect something might happen, and you build into your garden that plan. If you have the harsh weather coming, well, you've got your plastic, or you've got your hailcloth, or you've got the box to throw over your plants, whatever. That's planning for an unplanned event. And by planning ahead of time and being ready for it, now you're not going to have the devastation that some of us have the impact of the weather or the pests or whatever it is. Like the cicadas, for instance. Cicadas, for the most part, are an unplanned event. It happens so rarely that you don't think about it. But if you plan for that, now you're ready for it. But more importantly, I wanted to bring up the idea of garden design. And so when you're planning your garden, when you're designing your garden, and this holds true for your whole landscape, not just your vegetable garden. This also holds true for the fruit trees, for the perennial flowers, for everything you're growing. I plan for the unplanned event that might happen. And so many of you probably fall into this trap where we go to the nursery, we're looking for tomatoes, but while we're there, we see a shrub or a perennial flower or something else that's on sale and we just have to have it. Well, if your whole landscape and your whole garden is planted front to back, left to right, and there's no more space, then you see this beautiful plant and you can't get it. There's no place to put it. Or if you do get it, now you got to take out other plants to be able to put that plant in. And so when I say plan for the unplanned, when it comes to design and actual development of your garden, I leave open space throughout my landscape as I'm building it. And I have an idea in mind, and particularly in my front yard as I'm building it out and adding more plants. I have in mind the spots where I want to put a shrub, or I want to put another fruit tree, or like this year I'll be adding some elderberry. So I have some spots where I know I want to be putting those type of plants, whether it be an annual flower or a perennial flower, or it might be a grass. Whatever it is, leave space in your landscape so that when you come across these really unique plants, when you come across these bargains at the nursery, if you have a gardening friend that gives you a plant that you hadn't planned for, now you've got the space. Now you can put that plant in your landscape with very few concerns and worries. And yes, at some point, my garden is going to be a jungle. It is going to be completely filled. But until then, I'm okay with bare space. And by bare space, I'm not talking bare soil. The space is still covered by mulch. But I'm talking about an open area where I can put a shrub that's going to grow 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide. I don't know what that shrub is yet. I'm allowing the surprise to develop. I'm allowing me to just be wandering through a nursery someday or reading through a catalog and find the perfect plant. Well, because I've been saving that space, because I'm planning for the unplanned plant, when it happens, I'm good to go. I get the plant and I put it into that space that I intentionally left bare. And there are other spaces that are suitable for smaller flowers. I've got strips that I haven't planted yet that are 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. And when I discover the plants to put there, then I'll get those plants and fill up that space. But my yard is filled with unplanned areas. The vegetable garden holds true as well. I strongly encourage you to develop a planting plan and get your seeds. You may need to start them ahead of time indoors. You can direct sow some outdoors. But even within the vegetable garden, I leave space all around my beds, within the beds even, so that as the season progresses, if I find a plant that I really like and want to do more of it, and so I have succession planting ideas in place, well, I've already got a space in a bed that's ready to go. And so I did this last year with some of my beets, for instance, where I was growing beets and I had open space in my garden. And later in the season, some of this open space, it's like, what do I do with it? Well, I'd already harvested some of those golden beets earlier in the year, and they were so wonderful. It's like, oh, I hadn't planned to grow golden beets later in the season, but because I had the space and because I had discovered early in the season that I liked those golden beets, it was easy. Now I had a double harvest of golden beets last year. So don't think you have to fill every inch. Don't think that you have to plan everything out. Some of the wonderment of gardening is just to stumble across something that's wonderful, to see a plant that you never thought you would grow, and then suddenly you start growing it because you've got the space to grow it. Give yourself the freedom to be flexible in your planning and in your planting. And it actually starts with planning to have those unplanned events happen. And that way you can really avoid some of the tendencies that a lot of us gardeners fall into, where we have our plan, we grow the same plants every year, maybe we grow them in the same bed every year, we use the same methods every year, and then we see something new pop up, but we don't do that new thing because we don't have the space for it. We don't have the time for it. We don't have the desire often for it. And I'm saying build that desire. Have that space ready to go, so when you discover something different, something new, something you want to try that's outside your normal activities, you can do it. And it might mean that half of one of your beds remains fallow through the whole season. You may never discover whatever that thing is that's okay too. So some of your bed doesn't get planted. If you've got the space and you can allow some of your beds to just remain bare, that's fine too. But you may also find later in the season, garlic is something you want to grow more of. Well, now you've got that part of the bed that's available to put in your garlic cloves in fall. There's so many ways you can use this to your advantage, where you plan for the unplanned, you plan for the flexibility, you plan for things to change ahead of time. And then you can actually get out there and do some of these things, do the stuff that's going to make you happy, that's going to expand your gardening experience, expand your knowledge base, and really give you some of those good memories and some of those good stories to talk about when we talk about all the things we like to talk about in gardening. So there's the philosophy for the day. And of course, it extends beyond the gardening world. You just plan for those unplanned events. And then when they happen, it's not that big of a surprise. And you can actually use the unplanned event to your advantage because you're ready for it. And some of the best things that I've grown over the years are those kind of things that I never even thought about growing and then discovered they were great, like the Tithonia, the orange sunflowers behind me. It's a beautiful plant. They are just loved by so many beneficial insects. But it wasn't something I ever planned to grow until one year at the school garden. I was given a donation of seeds, and they included these orange sunflowers, which I had never even heard of before. That became an unplanned event that now influenced the way I garden for years afterwards because I love the plant. It does extremely well in my area. The insects love it early in the season. The birds love it later in the season. And it's beautiful and flowers for a long period of time. So it's things like this. It's planning for orange sunflowers that you never even knew existed. And suddenly you have the opportunity to put them in your garden. So I could talk all day long about the things that have influenced my gardening life that I never planned for. But by allowing the opportunity to expand my gardening world when these unplanned events happen, it just makes it all better, makes it all enjoyable, makes it all the kind of stuff to happen. So Indiana Backyard Gardener saying, got to get outside now. My greenhouse is temping at 102. You need to open up. You definitely need to open up. And it's also time for me to get outside and start doing some of the gardening activities that I want to get done today before our snows come at the end of the week. So I appreciate you being here today, especially all of you that are new and this is your first live stream. I hope to see you back here next Monday because I will definitely be back next Monday at the same time, same location, and we'll have a lot more gardening to talk about. I hope you have a great gardening week ahead as we start moving into spring here in the north. And those of you in the southern hemisphere that are starting to approach your fall, you've still got a lot of gardening left to do as well. So I hope you have a great gardening week, and I'll see you back 1 week from now. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.